by Rodney Stark that covers the question of the why of the Industrial Revolution. So, chapter 16 covers the sort of how and when and where of the Industrial Revolution. But this one seeks to answer the question of why. Why did England and then the United States lead the way in the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution happened at a particular place in time, and we can pinpoint it to England, to the textile industry, to the 1780s. And it really unfolds over the next several decades as steel and railroads and other industries get involved. But 1776, James Watt perfects his steam engine. The first place where it's really used en masse to produce things of an industrial nature is in Manchester, England, in the textile industry. Coal is being used to fire up these steam engines. It's being transported by railroads, which really get put in place in the 1820s to transport that coal, which requires steel for the rails, and there was a steel process. We talked about all of that last class. So why England? Why not somewhere else? Why not, why not France? Why not Italy? Why not China? Lots of people have said, China had inventiveness and ingenuity. They had gunpowder first. They had paper first. They may or may not have had a magnetic compass first. They had scholarship and learning. So why England? And then why, very quickly, was America the country that sort of rode the coattails and took over the lead? And Germany was also probably the third most successful industrializing country. Why is that? Well, let's just look and make sure that we are upholding our claims here properly. So relative levels of industrialization from 1750 to 1900. So what they did was they took the level of industrialization that existed in England and the UK in the year 1900, and that becomes the 100. That becomes fully industrialized, is that measure, right? So relative to that, how industrialized were other countries? And you can see the second one on here is the United States, and the third one on here is Germany, and then France, and then the Habsburg Empire. Is it a coincidence that the top three are all Protestant? And while the ones below it are either Catholic or Orthodox. I don't think that is a coincidence, and it has to do with literacy rates, which we'll get into in just a minute. So this is going to be a relatively brief class. Hopefully we'll cover the ground that you need, because some of this you will need for your paper that's coming up due in a week, and I will cover at the end of this online class what you need for that paper. All right, so Stark begins this chapter by actually saying that Karl Marx got something right. Karl Marx gets a lot of things wrong. His book Das Kapital, which is really his academic study of capitalism and his critique of capitalism, has many, many errors and many, many problems. The Communist Manifesto is even worse. But one of the things that Karl Marx gets right is that he says the Industrial Revolution was the revolution of the bourgeoisie. It was a movement of the bourgeoisie. Now, what is a bourgeoisie? Karl Marx had a very negative view of the bourgeoisie, and you'll see today in culture, whenever you hear the terms bourgeois, like bourgeois culture, bourgeois values, or that's so bourgeois, it's mostly used negatively, critically. And it's mostly used by people who are very liberal, who tend to be Marxists, frankly. And so they tend to look down on it because Karl Marx kind of looked down on them. But who were the bourgeoisie? Well, the bourgeoisie are the urban professionals. The non-nobles, so they're not aristocrats, they're not part of the nobility, but they tend to live in urban areas, and they tend to be professionals. They tend to be higher income lawyers, merchants, tradesmen, okay? And they become the owners of the means of production and the dominant class, and they derive their income from capitalism. Now, the bourgeoisie who led the Industrial Revolution rose in the Netherlands and in Great Britain first. Now, why would they rise in the Netherlands and in Great Britain first? Well, because of all the European countries, those two countries had the least powerful aristocracy, the least powerful nobility, and the most relative freedom, opportunity, and property rights. If you have freedom, social mobility, you have choices you can make, you can invest, you can get educated, you can move up in society. If you have opportunities to do so because there are viable commercial entities that you can invest in, there are real jobs that you can go out and get, and your property rights are secure. If you earn something and you attain something, it's not going to be taken away from you. These three, freedom, opportunity, and property rights, come together to create a rise of what Marx terms the bourgeoisie. And so in Europe, the bourgeoisie arose to prominence first in the Netherlands and in Great Britain. But they also arose, really from the beginning, in the United States. Because the United States, in many ways, was a nation created by the bourgeoisie. If you look at who the revolutionaries were in the American Revolution, many of them were Boston area merchants and traders or lawyers from Boston, from New York. And so they were the ones who led the way in the American Revolution. And so America has, from the very beginning, been a very, quote, bourgeois country, because the leaders of the revolution and the architects of our country have been educated urban professionals. And so it is not a coincidence that Marx sees the bourgeoisie as being the driving force of the Industrial Revolution, and you look at where the bourgeoisie are the most powerful and prominent, and it's England, the Netherlands, and the United States. And so England, the Netherlands, and the United States end up becoming highly successful under the Industrial Revolution. Now, Netherlands doesn't become so super successful in the Industrial Revolution because they have a lack of natural resources, and also because they were getting so much of their wealth already from international trade, from global trade. So they're a little bit of an outlier in that they have a strong bourgeoisie, but they don't end up becoming highly industrialized. They are industrialized, but not to the extent of the UK and the United States. All right, Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, he wrote this about Great Britain. He said, "That security which the laws of Great Britain give to every man, that he should enjoy the fruits of his own labor, is alone sufficient to make any country flourish. The natural effort of every individual is to better his own condition. When suffered to exert itself with freedom and security, is so powerful a principle that it is alone, without any assistance, capable of carrying on the society to wealth and prosperity. In Great Britain, industry is perfectly secure, and though it is far from being perfectly free, it is as free or freer than in any other part of Europe." So Adam Smith is writing this right at the same time as the American Declaration of Independence. So one of the reasons why Great Britain industrializes first is because America was just being born, and it took time for the government to be established, for security to be established, for us to sort of get our act together. And so we jump on the industrialization train a little bit later, but we're following in the footsteps of Great Britain, the mother country. But here, Adam Smith makes a brilliant point, and that is that freedom and security, property rights and liberty, are the driving force of wealth, prosperity, flourishing, because human beings have a natural desire. See, Adam Smith is not trying to work against human nature. He's trying to explain how human nature, we naturally want to better our own condition. We naturally want to rise. We naturally want to improve our lot in life. And so if we are given the freedom to do so, And if we are given the security to be able to keep what we gain when we do so, that will naturally create wealth and prosperity. But you need liberty and security. By the way, 1776 was quite a year. And this is an alternate possibility for your second paper for this class, is to write on what a year 1776 was, because you have three strains of thought coming together in 1776. You have capitalism really being sort of born in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, where his thesis that freedom and property rights will bring prosperity really leads to an understanding within those countries that embrace it of this is the way for us to become prosperous. You have at the same time Thomas Jefferson asserting political freedom, the right to change your government if the government is restricting your natural rights. So in the Declaration of Independence, which is adopted by the Continental Congress, heavily edited, of course. And then James Watt in the same year perfects the steam engine, which allows for the means of production for the Industrial Revolution. So in many ways we could say the modern world as we know it is born in 1776 with the Wealth of Nations, the Declaration of Independence, and the steam engine. And that would make a great paper to sort of explore how those three things are key and responsible for creating the modern world. All right, so what do you need really besides freedom and security? What do you need to have industry, the Industrial Revolution? Well, there's two key ingredients that are very practical, and that is you have to have labor and you have to have energy. So you have to have willing workers. And to get the number of workers who would be willing to do the work necessary to make the Industrial Revolution happen, you have to pay them decently. Contrary to what many socialists and liberals say about these things, the Industrial Revolution was actually better pay for people than the way they were living as subsistence farmers before. People would not have moved off the farm and into the city and into the factories if the pay was not better. People just wouldn't do that. Oh, let me leave behind my home and my family and the countryside and the work that my family's been doing for generations for less pay and less safe and harder working conditions. Yeah, let me do that. Like, nobody dragged these people off the farm in chains and chained them into the factories. They willingly went, and they willingly went because the pay was better. The opportunities to advance were better. So you have to have relatively high wages. You also have to have enough of a stable and productive agricultural system that people can leave the farm and the country not starve to death. So people aren't going to get off the farm and go into the factories if that means the food production is going to shut down. So you have to have a system of agriculture that is productive enough, prosperous enough, that it can afford to give up some of its labor force. So if a family has, 6 or 8 or 10 kids, which they did back in the day, you only need a couple to stay and work the farm. The rest can go move into the city and get jobs in the factories. You also need to have an educated population because the Industrial Revolution was led by people who had an education, people who understood math and science and engineering and business. They needed to have a good education. But also to be able to work some of the jobs require being able to read and write. So higher wages actually led to later marriages, particularly as women were able to work outside the home and earn money for themselves. They chose to put off marriage until later in life. That led to a lower birth rate, which in turn led to slower population growth, which in turn led to higher wages. So higher wages begat higher wages. And in England and in the United States, workers were paid the best of anywhere in the world, and that's part of the reason why those countries were the leaders of the Industrial Revolution. Also, having well-paid workers benefits the Industrial Revolution because those well-paid workers could buy the products that were coming off of the factory floor. So you're making cotton cloth and you're being paid well enough that you can buy the cotton clothing that's being made from the cloth that you're producing. Later, in the 20th century, Henry Ford would be famous for raising the wages of his workers to a level that was considered scandalous. He paid his workers almost twice as much as other factories. And part of the reason why he did that is he said he wanted his workers in his factories to be able to afford to buy a Model T Ford. So he wanted his workers to make enough money to be able to buy the products that they were producing. And that's a good model for industrial growth. But you need more than just people. You also need energy. Factories need energy to run. And the most abundant source of energy in the world, still to this day, for running factories and power plants is coal. And coal needs to be available, and you need to be able to get it inexpensively, and you need to be able to transport it inexpensively. Well, there do happen to be two countries that have an abundance of coal near the surface, and those two countries are Great Britain and the United States. Now, other countries have coal near the surface too, like China and Russia, but they were much further behind in the process of being able to develop industry to this level. So, you have freedom, you have security, you have labor, and you have energy, and you have an industrial revolution. But the culture also needs to be willing to embrace this industrial revolution, because there are some cultures that didn't want to have anything to do with industry. It was considered dirty, it was considered cheap, it was considered beneath their dignity and status. So you have to have a culture that appreciates and embraces trade and commerce. And older European powers like France and Spain that were based upon the aristocracy and the nobility, they valued land. This was actually one of the weaknesses of Thomas Jefferson, by the way, as an early American leader. Thomas Jefferson still held to the ideals of the agricultural system. Well, land is a limited commodity. There's only so much land that can be farmed. And so you're never going to become an abundantly prosperous society based on land and farming, because it's very fixed in terms of how much land can be farmed and how much produce can be produced. Now, science and technology has allowed us to produce a lot more food off of the same land than we were able to do 100 years ago or 200 years ago. However, it's still limited. There's only so much land. Factories can actually produce an ever-increasing amount of finished goods to make a better lifestyle for everyone, and the more you produce, the cheaper they become, and pretty soon you have Walmart selling lots of stuff that lots of people can afford all over the country. So you need commerce to be valued by the culture, but you also need a good educational system, a good schooling system, for two things. One is basic literacy for the population at large, and the second is for university-educated leaders for the new industry. And the best educational systems in the world at this time were found in Great Britain and the United States, both at the K-12 level, we would say. They didn't call it back then. Primary school level, grammar school level. For basic literacy, the highest literacy rates, the best teaching for literacy were found in Great Britain and in the United States and in Netherlands and in Germany. And then the best university systems were British and American. One of the first things that American colonists did within decades of coming over were to found universities. So by the time of the Declaration of Independence, you have in America Harvard and Yale and Brown and Dartmouth and Princeton and William and Mary and Union College in New York. You actually have more universities and good universities in America than you have in England at the time of the American Revolution. So we have, just to review, liberty, security, labor, energy, a value of commerce, and a good education. 6 ingredients that come together to create industry. Now, America came along and quickly became highly industrialized, and then eventually would overcome even England in terms of levels of industrialization. In terms of mass output of industry, nothing matches in world history, nothing matches the United States at the time of World War II. In many ways, we won World War II because we were able to produce far more planes and guns and tanks and jeeps than anybody else in the world. The ability of the American factory system to produce war materials in World War II was astounding. And it was probably the main reason why we were able to win that war. In America, 5 things come together. What's not shown on your screen is a value for commerce, which is there as well. But you have liberty and property rights. You also have patents to protect intellectual property, because among the property that needs to be secured is intellectual property. You have a great educational system from the beginning of the country. The highest literacy rates that have ever been recorded were in colonial New England. You have high wages, the highest wages in the world. And you also have an organized system for invention and innovation that Thomas Edison was really one of the architects of. Thomas Edison is famous for having taken 2,000 tries to invent the light bulb, but he invented a whole lot of other things. And it wasn't really him as like a creative genius individual. It was the people who worked with him at Menlo Park, which was an invention laboratory in New Jersey. And later, General Electric, which Edison founded, and IBM, and Westinghouse, and others became committed to innovation and invention. And still to this day, innovation and invention is something that is tied to America really dominantly. If you look at things that were invented in the world, that changed the world, and you start in the year 1865 and you come to the year 2015, you can cover 150 years of human history, and almost everything that has changed the world over the last 150 years was invented in America. From the internet and Facebook and smartphones to the atomic bomb, nuclear energy, automobiles, airplanes, telephones, telegraphs, phonographs, moving pictures. I mean, you could go through a huge list. Radio, television, it all was invented in America in 150 years' time. And how does that happen? That's mind-blowing to think about all the things that have changed the world that have come from America. And it's because in America, it's not because we're Americans, it's because in America you've had liberty, property rights, protection of intellectual property, a great educational system, high wages, and organized systems of invention and innovation. All right, a little bit on your paper and then we'll be done with class. Your paper is really to be written about revolution. And I want you to sort of explore the difference between what revolution is and what reformation is. Revolution is defined, these are the Oxford online dictionaries, as a forcible overthrow of a government or social order in favor of a new system. So again, the key terms here are forcible overthrow in favor of a new system. So we throw around this word revolution a lot, but very few things actually are revolutionary. Instead, reformation is the act or process of reforming an institution or practice, and many of the things that we call revolutions are actually more like reformations. So to explore this idea, you can compare and contrast the American Revolution with the French Revolution. The American Revolution was based upon English common law and the English Constitution and the English Bill of Rights, and began as an appeal to the king, to King George III, to say, please respect our rights as British citizens. And then even after there was, in fact, a forcible overthrow of a government in favor of a new system. So it was a revolution, I'm not going to deny that. But when the new system of government was put into place, they really sought to flesh out things that they had already had in place in England for years. And so you had a bicameral legislature. In England, they have House of Lords, House of Commons. We don't have nobility in America, so we have a Senate and a House. You have a Bill of Rights. You have constitutional government without a monarchy and without an aristocracy. The French Revolution was much different. The French Revolution was like, we hate the established order, we don't want to have anything to do with it, burn it down, off with their heads, out with the old, in with the new. It's much more radical, it's much more violent, it's much more unstable, and it's much less successful because it is all of those things. The scientific revolution wasn't even really a revolution at all. It was just a period of advancement within science. Science already existed before the scientific revolution. Science existed after the scientific revolution. It just during the 150-year period from about 1550 to about 1700, you had a lot of advancement in science. Most of it being done by Christians who were not looking to overthrow any social order. The Industrial Revolution changed things much more powerfully than the Scientific Revolution. It changed the world in about 50 years, but it wasn't a forcible overthrow of an established social order. It did lead to the decline and eventual demise of the aristocracy in Europe. It did. So there was social order change, but it was not an attempt to forcibly overthrow an established social order. Instead, it was an attempt to make a better way of producing goods. How can we make clothing faster, cheaper, more abundantly? How can we make furniture faster, cheaper, more abundantly? How can we make carriages faster, cheaper, more abundantly? How can we make firearms faster, cheaper, more abundantly? You're getting the picture, right? So it's not so much a revolution as an acceleration, and I would say it's a type of reformation through invention and innovation. So that's your paper. You're basically comparing and contrasting either the American to the French Revolution or the scientific and the Industrial Revolution. And in comparing and contrasting, you're going to be exploring the idea of revolution and what revolution is versus reformation. And if you don't like that idea at all, you can just write a paper on why 1776 is a very important year for changing the world. All right, I said a lot. I said it fast. But we got it done in 28 minutes. So I will see you guys in class next week.